Good morning. We'll continue with an analysis of Color Purple. As we discussed in the previous class, the novel Color Purple won the American Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize in 1983. It was written in 1982. And this particular novel is so unique because it is preoccupied with spiritual survival and also with exploring the oppressions, the insanities, the loyalties, and the triumphs of Black women. So Walker's major interest, when we analyze the novel, we realize that Walker's major interest is whether or how change can occur in the lives of our Black characters. So we see when we look at the characters, except for characters like Nettie and Sugar Avery, the other characters lead insular lives. They are unaware of what is occurring outside their own small neighborhood or ambience. So they are particularly unaware of the large social and political currents sweeping across the world. So despite their isolation, however, they work through the problems of racism, sexism, violence, oppression, and in the end, they manage to achieve wholeness both personally and also communally. So in form and content, we can say that The Color Purple is a slave narrative. It is the life of a former slave who has gained freedom through many trials and tribulations, right? So instead of Black oppression by whites, in this novel, what we see is there is also something which I was mentioning earlier, Black oppression by the Blacks. So how the Black women are oppressed by their own Black men. So this is basically the story of a Black woman. We can say story of Black women, actually, not just a Black woman, Black women. And this is a story by a Black woman. Like Alice Walker is also Black, right? So in this novel, we see how women fight, how they support each other, how they love, how they heal each other, and how they grow together. So this here we can see something called womanism or sisterhood. We'll discuss about that more later. So this novel is something, it's a novel that begins in, you can say, abject despair, but it ends in intense joy. So when we go through this, like when we go through this novel, we realize that there is transformation that occurs, right? So how does this transformation occur? So when we examine the novel, we can just come to the conclusion that there are three aspects which we need to look. One is the relationship between men and women. Second is the relationship between women. And the third is relationship among people, God, nature. So these are the three important aspects that we need to analyze when we read this novel, because there is transformation that occurs in this novel, and this transformation occurs through these three relationships. Right? So at the beginning of the novel, we see there is alienation, there is separation, which is evident in all these relationships, right? Relationship between men and women, relationship between women, and relationship among God, people, and nature. But at the end of the novel, what we understand is there is an integration that exists among all elements of life. So, in terms of relationship between men and women, no personal contact between both the sexes is possible at the beginning of the novel, because at the beginning of the novel, what we get, the idea that we get is the male feels that he is the dominating person and he can only dominate the female through brutality. Now, the correspondence between Celie and Nettie, the letters that Nettie writes to Celie and then how Celie addresses her letters to Nettie, is the novel's most basic example of the alienation of women from women. Now, this alienation between Nettie and Celie is something that is caused by men only, right? Because it is Albert or Mr. Dash who keeps Nettie's letters away from Celie. But sometimes we realize it is the attitude of the women themselves, because women take everything lying down in this novel. They accept everything that comes upon them, right? So sometimes we feel that this kind of alienation is the result of the attitude of women, because when we analyze the first half of the novel, we see how women are against one another, because it can be jealousy, because you can see where Sugar mocks Celie and she flaunts her relationship with Mr. Dash, or Celie's husband. Now, Walker presents numerous examples of women in competition with one another, frequently because of men, but more importantly because they have accepted the social, you can say, construction that women define themselves by their relationship with the men in their lives. So that is why, we always realize when we read the novel that women, though they are kind of brutally attacked and though they are treated like doormats, they don't stand up for each other in the beginning of the novel because they always believe that the social code that if they have to have some kind of identity, it will be only in relationship with a man in their lives. So they try to kind of, even when the man kind of brutally attacks or brutally kind of suppresses them, they are ready to accept all that and stick up to their men and fight against other women or mock other women because what they feel is their identity is only defined by a male, and that is the gender construction or the social construction that we see. So here we see how Celie she instigates Harpo to beat up Sophia, right, to make her obey him. So all this is because it has been constructed, or they have felt, or it has been ingrained into them that their identity is accepted only in relationship with a man. So the first indication that the separation between women will be overcome occurs when the women surmount their jealousy and they come together. So we call it the sisterhood of women. So central to this development is the closeness of that develops between Celie and Sugar. So it is Sugar who teaches Celie so much about herself. She teaches her to stand up for herself, to Mr. Dash, to Albert. She teaches her about her own beauty and her self-worth. She teaches Celie about the enjoyment of her own body. And see, when we look at the relationship of Celie and Sugar, we realize that it is perhaps the strongest bond in the novel. The relationship between Celie and Nettie is also very strong, but the strongest bond is between Celie and Sugar. So, when the sisterhood of women is formed, or the female community is formed, we find that the men in the novel seem to have no part in the female community, which in essence, it exists in opposition to them. They too are working out their salvation. As a result of the way the women have opposed them, they start re-evaluating their own lives and they come to a greater sense of their holiness as well as that of women. So that is why Albert, or Mr. Dash, he repents, there's a transformation in him also. So the women in the novel develop relationship with women on different and more fulfilling level towards the end of the novel. So the weakness of the men is also something that has been ingrained into them due to societal construction, because they have followed the dictates of their fathers, right, rather than having followed their own desires. This is how it has been taught to them also, and that is why they treat women like this. See, Mr. Dash or Albert wanted to marry Sugar, but he is not allowed to. His father does not allow him. In the face of his father's opposition, he marries Celie. And what does he do to Celie? He makes her life miserable because she is not Sugar. Now, Harpo tries to model his relationship with Sophia on the relationship between his father and Celie. So he sees how his father is mistreating Celie or brutally attacking Celie, and he tries to do that with Sophia. And even Celie tells him that, right? But ultimately, both these men, Mr. Dash or Albert and Harpo, they find salvation because they realize that women stand up to them and then they undergo transformation and they accept their own gentler side. So this is what the novel is all about. So there's transformation not only in women, but there's also transformation in men. So women learn to stand up for themselves. They learn to understand their own identity. They learn to appreciate their own worth. At the same time, we see men also undergoing a change. They try to understand what they are. When the women in their lives stand up against them, they realize that they also need to change. So they try and change and they try accepting their own gentler side. Right? So when we talk about the power of the narrative and voice in the novel, What we find in The Color Purple is Alice Walker emphasizing that the ability to express one's thought and feelings is crucial to developing a sense of self. Right? So in the beginning, we see Celie is completely unable to resist those people who abuse her. Now, when her stepfather or Alfonso rapes her, he tells her, better not tell nobody but God, right? And she remembers that. And when she remembers his abuse, she feels that the only way to persevere is to remain silent and invisible. So Celie is essentially an object, an entirely passive party who has no power to assert herself through actions or words. So her letters to God, in which she begins to pour out her story, become her only outlet. That's the only way she can give vent to her feelings. And because she is so unaccustomed to articulating her experience, we see that her narrative is quite muddled, despite her best efforts to make it transparent. Now, in Sugar and Sophia, Celie finds sympathetic women, women who lent their ears, and she learns from them lessons that enable her to find her muffled voice. So, Celie is like, Sugar calls Celie a virgin. Now, in the technical terms, Celie might not be a virgin, but Sugar tells her that you are a virgin because whenever you had sex with somebody, it was not because you wanted it, it was because they raped you. So as long as you don't enjoy the aspect of sex, you are still a virgin. So Sugar actually shows Celie that she can create her own narrative. She can create a new interpretation of herself. She can create her own history that counters the interpretations that are forced upon her. So here we see Celie slowly beginning to bring out more of her story by telling it to Sugar. She gives a body to her story, right? And even then, Celie is still a little submissive. But when she discovers Nettie's letter, it is then that Celie finally realizes that she had enough. And she realizes that she has enough knowledge of herself. No, she's so angry with Mr. Dash. She's so angry with Albert. And then from that point onwards, she forms her own powerful narrative. Right? So she does, her newfound power, her forceful assertion of this newfound power, right? How does it come out? It comes out in the form of her cursing Albert for his years of abuse. And that is when we see the climax of the novel. This, Celie's story, the way she kind of wins out, shocks him and eventually humbles Albert, Mr. Dash, causing him to reassess and change his own life. So, Alice Walker wants to clearly emphasize the power of narrative and speech to assert selfhood and resist oppression. But sometimes a novel acknowledges that such resistance can be risky, because when we see Sophia resisting like this, when the mayor's wife, Miss Millie, invites her to be a maid, she forcefully retorts. Even she goes to the extent of slapping the mayor, right? So sometimes the resistance can also create problems. And because of Sophia's forceful outburst, she loses 12 years of her life. She is supposed to be a maid. Though she regains her freedom eventually, and we see that she is not totally defeated, but she pays a high price for her words. So it's not easy in all situations. And again, another aspect what we see is Walker throughout the novel portrays female friendships as a means for women to get the courage to tell stories. Now, when the women tell these stories, it allows them to resist oppression and dominance. So relationships among the women form a kind of refuge. It provides reciprocal love in a world filled with male violence. So we see in this particular novel female ties taking many forms. Some are motherly, some are sisterly, some are in the form of a mentor relationship, some are sexual, some are simply friendships. So, Sophia claims that her ability to fight comes from her strong relationships with her sisters. Nettie's relationship with Seeley anchors her through years of living in the unfamiliar culture of Africa. See, Samuel, when he lives in Africa, Samuel and Corinne, you remember the missionary couple, right? When Samuel and Corinne live in Africa, Samuel realizes that the strong relationships among the Olinka women. See, Olinka women are the particular tribe in Africa amongst whom Samuel and Corinne was. And ultimately, it is one of the Olinka women, Tashi, that Samuel's son Adam gets married to. Right? So Samuel notes that this strong relationships that exist among the Olinka women is the only thing that makes polygamy so bearable for them. See, in the Olinka tribe, men can take as many wives as they want. And it is this strong relationships that women build among themselves that makes them tolerate this aspect of polygamy. And you also understand how Seeley and Sugar get so bonded, and this bonding is what ultimately leads to Seeley's redemption and her attainment of a sense of self. Right? When we look at the theme of the racism and sexism, the nature of racism and sexism in the novel, we understand that none of the abusers in Alice Walker's novel are stereotypical or one-dimensional monsters who we can kind of dismiss as evil people. The people who perpetuate violence themselves are victims, often of sexism, racism, or paternalism. See, one example that we see is Harpo. Now, why does Harpo beat Sophia? Harpo beats Sophia because Seeley instigates him, that's there. But another thing is because his father, or Mr. Dash, or Albert, implies that Sophia resisting you, Harpo, is making you less of a man. That actually kind of irritates him, that sentence. So he doesn't want to be known as less of a man. So he wants Sophia to be completely, submissive to him. That is why he beats her up. Right? Mr. Dash or Albert is a very violent person. He mistreats his family, and he does it because his father was a tyrant, and his father had treated him the same way. So he himself is a victim, and that is why he does that to Seeley, right? And Seeley advises Harpo to beat Sophia because she's jealous. She's jealous of Sophia's strength. And she's jealous of the way Sophia asserts herself. So it is a cyclic nature, right? So the characters in the novel are also very much aware of the cyclic nature of harmful behavior, right? So we have the mayor's daughter, Elena Jane, right? And when Sophia is the maid there, she tells Elena Jane that societal influence makes it almost inevitable that her baby boy will grow up to be a racist. It's because society makes you like that. Now, only by forcefully talking back to the men who abuse them and showing them a new way of doing things, do the women of this novel break these cycles of sexism and violence. And then it causes the men who abuse them to re-examine their lives. They just stop and re-examine their lives, right? What about the disruption of traditional gender roles? Now, there are traditional gender roles, right? Many of the characters in this novel break the boundaries of traditional male or female gender roles, right? Now, for example, Sophia. Sophia is very strong, she's very sassy, right? Sugar is very assertive, sexual assertiveness is there. Harpo's insecurity. These are all, major examples of such disparity between a character's gender and the traits he or she displays. So, this blurring of gender traits that we see sometimes involves sexual ambiguity, as we see in the sexual relationship that develops between Sugar, Avery, and Seeley. Now, disruption of gender roles sometimes causes a lot of problems. See, Harpo's insecurity about his masculinity. masculinity leads to marital problems and his attempts to beat Sophia. Now, Sugar's confident sexuality and resistance to male domination makes her, people label her as a tramp, as a loose woman. Throughout the novel, what is Walker trying to do? She wants to emphasize that gender and sexuality are not as simple as we believe. This writing or this particular novel, it subverts subversion and defies the traditional ways in which we understand women to be women and men to be men. When we analyze the recurring images or the motives in The Color Purple, we've got a couple of recurrent images or motives, right? First one is letters. Now, this is an epistolary novel. We call it an epistolary novel, right? So, Walker uses this epistolary form to emphasize the power of communication. Now, Celie is writing letters to God. Nettie is writing letters to Celie. Both these sisters, they gain strength from their letter writing. And they are actually saved only when they receive responses to their letters. So, therefore, writing letters enables self-expression and confession. That's true. But it also requires a willing audience. If you do not have an audience, there's no salvation, right? So, when Nettie writes letters to Celie and she does not get a response, she feels lost. Because for her, she is able to bring out her agency or, show her agency through Celie. Celie is her only audience. And Nettie grows disillusioned with her missionary work because what she feels is that the imperialists will not listen to her and because the Ulinka villagers are stubborn. So only when Nettie comes back to Georgia to Celie is an audience guaranteed, then only she feels fulfilled and free. So writing letters, okay, that is one way of it. It is an expression it is maybe a medium to vent out your feelings. But if there's no willing audience, there is no salvation through this. Right? Then you have this rural farm community. So Alice Walker has set this novel in a rural farm community and she focuses on the colorful portraits of each of the characters. Now, when she focuses on the personal lives and transformation of the characters, Walker renders public events almost irrelevant, because when Sugar and Celie hear news of current events from outside the world, from the outside world, it just sounds crazy to them, right? So the unspecific time and place, it broadens the novel's scope, making its themes more universal. The novel is titled The Color Purple, right? The Color Purple. Now, colors is a recurrent image, right? Because throughout this novel, the appearance of brighter colors indicates the liberation various characters experience, right? So Walker is using the color to signal renewals and rebirths at several points in the novel. So when you see Kate taking Celie shopping for a new dress, the only color options are very dull ones, brown, dark blue, maroon and all that. But later, Celie and Sophia, they use bright yellow fabric from Sugar's dress to make a quilt. See, then she gets into this sewing business. She makes all brightly colored trousers and quilts, right? So, when Celie describes her religious awakening, she marvels how she she never noticed the wonders that God has made, such as the color purple. That is how this novel is named. It's a flower. Color purple is a flower, right? So, even when you see Mr. Adash or Albert transforming at the end, you see him painting the entire interior of his house fresh and white. That signals a new beginning, right? Then we have a few symbols in the color purple, which we will discuss in the next class, right? So I think today we've discussed about a little bit of the analysis of this novel, and we also talked about the themes and also the recurrent images or the motives that we see in the novel. In the next class, we can discuss a little bit about the symbols. I hope this is clear. Any questions?